Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 74, Clouds 12. Kakuzu raised an eyebrow as sand burst from the ground around him, swirling violently before suddenly constricting down on him. Naruto waited patiently from outside the localized sandstorm, eyes slowly roaming around. It was a shame he couldn't use his sand and water sense at the same time, but the two were fairly interchangeable. After all, he could still feel Kakuzu right in the middle. The blonde frowned as Kakuzu's chakra signature suddenly vanished from inside the small tornado of sand just as it violently bulged inwards. That would have trapped most other people, but even as he thought that he had to jump forward, just in time for a volley of odd gray tendrils, no thicker than Senbon, to go flying over him. However, his dodge wasn't enough, as proven when those same tendrils suddenly diverted, slamming down into the ground with enough force to cause rocks and dust to fly into the air. Is this really all the Rinnegan can do? Sasori must have been far weaker than I thought. Perhaps I should have cashed in his bounty after all. The Akatsuki member reappeared with a flicker of movement, revealing that the gray threads had emerged from his arm. Slowly the smoke cleared around where his attack had impacted, and he heard a light chuckle, when it was clear enough to see Kakuzu simply raised an eyebrow again. Wow, you're fast, definitely faster than me, that's for sure. At least when I'm like this. Naruto slowly stood up, revealing that the volley of dangerous gray threads hadn't even scratched him, even though Kakuzu had felt them all hit the blonde. Mildly impressive. You have some form of armor or defense beyond that irritating sand. Naruto just grinned as he dusted off his robes, now a little torn from the thin tentacles attack. And you are like a walking rag doll. What is that anyway? Kakuzu grunted as the tendrils retracted back into his arm like whips, returning to the separation in his forearm where they quickly wove back in like macabre stitches. Naruto imagined that wasn't the only place on his body those threads could leave or attack from, so he knew to be wary. I have no need to tell a brat like you anything. Naruto just shrugged as he lazily lifted an arm, tracking Kakuzu as the man suddenly launched forward. Normally it would have been far too fast for Naruto to react to in taijutsu, but he wasn't using his body for this. Shinra Tensei. Mid-air, a few feet from where Naruto stood, Kakuzu suddenly widened his eyes as he was sent flying back with the force of a small freight train, and he had been to Yuki no Kuni, so he knew how powerful those were. The man's body created a small trench through the ground as he ripped through it, tendrils lashing out at random into the ground to halt his crash. Naruto stayed where he was, gazing curiously into the small cloud of dust that he had created this time. Well, I suppose that is the so-called invisible attack I was warned against. It's certainly. A figure emerged from the smoke to reveal Kakuzu hadn't taken any damage either, although his Akatsuki robe was torn to shreds from the rocks he had crashed through. Formidable. He quickly discarded the bulky robe, revealing the gruesome form of his body. He had naturally tanned skin like many Takigakure shinobi, but nearly everywhere on his body those gray threads stitched him together like some poorly constructed doll. You interest me, Kyubi Jinchuriki. Perhaps in a few years you would have had a bounty worth catching my eye. It's almost a shame you won't. Now let's try this again. Naruto grimaced as he heard a strange squelching sound coming from Kakuzu's chest, only for his eyes to widen a moment later as his hands both detached, sending another volley of the vicious threads his way. However, this time as he took a step back he raised his hand, causing the barrage of tendrils to suddenly halt in midair as they struck an invisible wall of force. The blonde frowned, knowing he couldn't let those near him again now, before the tendrils had enough force to actually dent his Azura Path's defense. However, now they were even more deadly as they were covered in a buzzing, faintly luminescent glow. Kakuzu had ran lightning chakra down the threads to increase their penetrating power. If they were to actually hit him, he was sure he would be skewered. However, even as his mind figured this out, the threads were pushing back against the wall of force they had encountered, and Naruto's 3 seconds hadn't quite counted down yet, so he did the next best thing. Banzhou Tenin. As he held one hand out to maintain his Shinra Tensei, he crossed his other one over it, aiming at a particularly large tree on the other side of the clearing. Kakuzu was hardly unprepared as the enormous tree suddenly flew at him from behind, and instantly more threads burst from the ground, catching it and breaking it too before throwing the 2 halves to either side. However, it had weakened his concentration long enough for Naruto to move out of the way of his barrage of threads, leaving the 2 standing across from one another again. With every move you reveal more and more of yourself to me, bringing us closer to the inevitable end where I carry you back to the Akatsuki, where your bijou will be ripped out. It doesn't matter how powerful those eyes are in Legend, I am a living legend and experience will always beat you upstarts. Naruto just gazed at the man evenly, sizing him up. So far he had only displayed this ability with these odd threads and a lightning affinity, but he must be a powerful shinobi if he was in the same organization as Itachi Uchiha and Kisame Hashigake. Alright, I'll play along. Really, he was just stalling for time, trying to gather senjutsu as quickly as he could. Kakuzu was definitely faster than him, like this, as Naruto was only 16, and he could only guess at this man's age. Kakuzu simply frowned as thicker, stronger-looking tendrils suddenly burst from the earth around Naruto, imitating what Blonde had tried to do to him with his sand. Do not think I don't know the signs for when somebody is gathering senjutsu. I know you need to remain still, so I won't allow it. The tendrils all shot at Naruto from every side, not leaving him any space to avoid them. Sand whirled around him defensively, but the lightning-enhanced thread sliced through it like it was water. Naruto was still getting over his shock that Kakuzu knew about senjutsu, that made the second Akatsuki member to recognize Sage Mode. His eyes pulsed with chakra, and the threads were once again halted by an all-encompassing wall of force centered on the blonde, but it didn't buy him nearly enough time to gather enough nature chakra. Instead, he had to dash away, skidding to a stop some distance away as Kakuzu turned to him with a level stare. The thread simply vanished back into the ground, making Naruto glance about warily. He caught the tiny tremors before the tendrils actually emerged, pivoting his foot to turn and run in the opposite direction. However, he could only widen his eyes in surprise as he ran straight into even more of them. Blood dripped from the edge of his mouth as he looked down in shock, not even able to count the numerous places he was skewered on Kakuzu's threads. It was pointless from the start, Kyubi Jinchuriki. You are too young and too weak to have lasted long against me. Naruto managed to turn his head to look at the man as he walked closer to him. The blonde managed to smile even as blood continued to drip from his many wounds. Oh, I think I lasted just long enough, to be honest. Kakuzu was suddenly slammed by a crippling force that sent the man crashing straight into the ground, creating a colossal crater and leaving a gaping trench in the earth that could have been mistaken for a dyed riverbed. The Naruto skewered on his now limp threads vanished in a burst of smoke after giving a childish grin. At the same moment, the real Naruto rose out of the ground, his eyes flashing golden as he walked towards the crater the Akatsuki member still lay in. How's that for experience? Did you learn something? The blonde easily diverted his head to the side as another, tighter-packed volley of threads suddenly launched at him from the smoke, reaching over and catching the gray threads without trouble. He felt the slight tingle from the lightning-natured chakra running through the tendrils, but nothing else. He grinned as he quickly absorbed the man's chakra. The threads were an amazing conductor for chakra like his rods, so it was almost too easy. His eyes tracked the incoming wave of the dangerous gray threads, as though they were moving through treacle. When nature energy surged through his system, it was like the entire world slowed down. He was in harmony with it, able to understand the tiniest motions and predict how they would play out. As soon as the lightning-infused tendrils got near him, it was as though they had passed through an invisible bubble. The crackling aura of blue energy around them vanished, drained away into Naruto's body. The threads themselves managed to get through, however they could only uselessly pound against his Azura Path's hardened metal skin, not even managing to dent it. You were right, you shouldn't have given me time to gather Senjutsu chakra. Usually using 2 of my paths at once like this is pretty hard, but I still haven't even found my limits when I tap into nature's energy. Naruto grinned as his grip over the loosely packed bundle of threads tightening, the veins in his arms bulging ever so slightly as he suddenly turned, throwing Kakuzu and his thin tentacles clear across the clearing with a grunt of effort. The man had been fruitlessly trying to anchor himself to the ground with more threads, but Naruto ripped him out like a stubborn weed. The Akatsuki member was surprised, but he still managed to twist his body to land roughly on the round, his feet gouging out small trenches. HMPFT, you may know how to access Sage Mode, but you don't even begin to scratch at the potential of the Shodai Hokage. You can't stay this way for long, I know that much. However, Kakuzu couldn't help but widen his eyes as Naruto suddenly blurred out of his sight. Actually, you would be surprised. The aged Taki Nuke-nin instantly lashed out with a vicious backhanded punch as Naruto's voice suddenly sounded right behind him. However, the blonde caught the fist with one hand, the force of the blow creating small shockwaves in the air. In almost exactly the same way he caught Kakuzu's second punch, grabbing the fist tightly as the small crater that had formed beneath the pair only grew. I'm willing to bet I can hold on to Sage Mode long enough to deal with you easily. The blonde grinned as Kakuzu continued to struggle against the young monk's seemingly infinite strength. Unless you have any more tricks than these threads of yours. Beneath Kakuzu's mask the aged shinobi smirked. It had been a long time since he had a bounty fight back like this. Oh, more tricks than your young mind could believe. Hundreds of threads burst from all over his skin, flowing out like a doll's stuffing to try and entangle the blonde. At this close range it should have been impossible to dodge, and he could leisurely strangle the monk until he had passed out. No need to kill the target after all when he was being paid to bring him in alive. However, he could only frown as he heard a light whining sound beneath him. Out of the corner of his discolored eyes he could the briefest flashes of light before he was sent rocketing back, riding a blast of what looked to be pure energy. Naruto simply maintained his grin as the can in his hand had become finished cycling with energy, deconstructing and reconstructing back into his normal 5-fingered appendage that he flexed experimentally. He had learned a lot from his fight with his darker half. If he had power, then he was obligated to use it, but for the right reasons. After all, a jutsu or a technique is simply a tool and can be used for both bad and good. It was the intent behind it that mattered in the end. That was certainly interesting. Kakuzu emerged from the tree line he had barreled through, unharmed but not without a mark. The vest he wore beneath his robes fluttered to the ground, revealing even more of his macabre stitching, and the large burn mark across his stomach. But if you want to turn this into a game of firepower, then you are 100 years too early to be challenging the likes of me. Naruto simply got into a ready stance, getting slightly irritated with the man's deep gravelly voice and all his self-hype. Get ready, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Naruto grimaced as that same horrible squelching sound came from the man again. However, this time, he could see something move under his chest. Suddenly 2 masks burst from the man's back, as if to look over the man's shoulders. They looked somewhat like ANBU masks, except more stylized, one with a cartoonish red grin and the other with a short, distended snout. As one they opened their mouths, revealing a mass of black and gray threads that composed them. Before the first released a massive fireball, and the other, a ball of pure wind. The 2 attacks merged in midair, creating a roaring inferno that barreled towards Naruto like a small sun. However, when the attack hit, there was no catastrophic blast, no intense shockwave, as the energy contained within the chakra-empowered fireball exploded like Kakuzu would have and had been expecting. Instead, he watched with marginally widened eyes as the attack slowly dwindled away in front of the blonde as he absorbed every ounce of chakra in the raging fireball. The ancient Akatsuki member stood there for a moment, grimacing beneath his mask as the monk finished up absorbing his ninjutsu. The blonde finally grinned as the last wisps of fire flickered away, revealing him to be completely unharmed. Come on, is that your trump card? Big ninjutsu? Even though he was taunting, Naruto was impressed. The man had displayed strong affinities for 3 elements already, an impressive feat. However, he was doing it Come on now, you've put a fire in my belly, what else you got? Kakuzu frowned as two more masks burst from his back, this time one with elongated ears and a sick grin, and another with a beak, making it look like a bird. The two seemed to charge huge amounts of chakra for just a split second before the second mask launched a drilling bullet of water and the first, a blinding bolt of lightning that as it passed through the air seemed to darken the space around it. Once again Naruto didn't even move from his position, absorbing the combination attack with ease. However, with each attack he was coming to understand Kakuzu better and better. Each mask seemed to represent an element and could fire off the respective ninjutsu. However, Naruto had yet to meet an elemental jutsu he couldn't absorb, and each one only made him stronger, giving him more chakra to mold with nature chakra. However, Kakuzu hadn't lasted in the cruel shinobi world as long as he had without learning on the fly. While Naruto was temporarily blinded by the ninjutsu in front of him, Kakuzu's hands burst from the ground behind him. If Naruto could have seen around the attack, he would have noticed they had separated from Kakuzu's body, but were still attached to him through the threads. One hand latched onto the back of his neck while the other drove a powerful punch right into the base of his spine, aiming to paralyze or at least stun the blonde. However, what Kakuzu didn't know was that Naruto could in fact look around the attack with the two shadow clones hidden in the trees, sharing their vision with him. Geru Kusari. Leaving one hand up to continue absorbing the large ninjutsu, Naruto let his other form into a half-ram seal. As his chakra surged, black chains the width of his finger burst from his back, wrapping around Kakuzu's hands until they were completely immobilized. When the intense light of the combination ninjutsu faded, the blonde could easily see Kakuzu's intense frown from three different perspectives. How, something like that should be impossible for a brat like you. How could you possibly do so many things at once? Kakuzu's voice wasn't hysteric or even urgent, but his deep gravelly voice contained a lot more irritation than before as the monk simply smiled. When you sometimes have to share your sight 6 different ways, you get good at multitasking. The chain suddenly constricted, making Kakuzu grimace again as he felt his hands slowly being crushed. However, before Naruto could do it, the masks on the Akatsuki members' backs suddenly broke off of him, taking a huge mass of the dark threads with them that congealed into deformed, nightmarish bodies. Each creature rushed the blonde, forcing him to move out of the way and drop his ram seal, allowing the chains securing Kakuzu's hands to simply fade away. Once again the two were back to watching each other from across the clearing. However, this time the monster-like masked creatures had slowly surrounded Naruto. He observed them for a few moments. A Shinra Tensei probably wouldn't do much to them, as they were simply a mass of threads that could evenly distribute the force. In that same vein, they were probably immune to most types of cutting or blunt force damage due to their unique makeup. That probably meant they were controlled through the masks, so he had to destroy those first. He grinned, deciding to test his theory as he placed his hands together. A burning purple flame formed around his clasped hands as potent Yin chakra combined with life-giving yang. Banbutsu Suzu, Getsugassen. Slowly Naruto pulled his hands apart, and as he did, a long metal pole formed between them, tipped on one end by a large spade-like blade and on the other, a crescent moon-like extension on the end of a short chain. I may not be as skilled as Chirika-senpai with this, but I've had a lot of time to practice over the last few years. He brought the monk's spade about so he was in a low forward stance, the spade itself behind him in a reverse grip so the spade pointed upwards across his shoulders. Chiriku? Of the Fire Temple? Naruto faltered for a moment as Kakuzu's deep voice cut across the silence. Yes, he has a bounty of 30 million ryo, if I'm not mistaken. A worthy quarry. Naruto could feel the smirk cross Kakuzu's face as the black thread creatures tensed to attack. Perhaps after I am done here I should head over to Hai no Kuni. There are a few bounties I have been meaning to collect over there for a while now. When Kakuzu looked back around, Naruto's head hung a little lower, locks of his hair spilling over his horned headband to shadow his eyes. I'll never give you the chance, you will never hurt my senpai as long as I can stop it. Naruto's head suddenly flashed up at the same moment he spun, lashing out with his monk's spade at the seemingly invisible enemy. However, the attack he launched was far from intangible, as evidenced when Kakuzu's water mask suddenly split in two, the broken shards of the porcelain face falling uselessly to the ground as the creature simply seemed to melt. Before Kakuzu could compensate, Naruto had already lashed out 3 more times in an intricate dance of movements, launching near-invisible blades of wind in every direction. One by one the 4 masks shattered and broke, spilling blood to the ground as whatever was inside to control them was neatly bisected by the sharp blades of wind. Naruto let out a long breath as his hand slid down the monk's blade staff as he twirled it a final time before gently touching it to the ground, watching as it dissipated into black dust that quickly floated away. He turned, catching Kakuzu's eyes with his own as he straightened up, walking forward slowly. "You brat, this isn't over yet." Threads once again burst from the ground around the blonde, but he simply raised a hand as his eyes pulsed with chakra, and they couldn't touch him, halting a few feet from him and allowing him to pass easily. Kakuzu took an unconscious step back as the blonde continued to advance. He was smaller than the Akatsuki, but at that moment he might as well have been a giant for as much as Kakuzu could stop him. Threads continued to harass the monk fruitlessly as he walked forward, either bouncing off his hardened skin or deflected by his gravity attacks. "Damn it, I refuse to lose to a brat like you. I've lived over 90 years and fought the Shodai Hokage himself. My legacy is too great to end here." Naruto ignored the man's words as he picked up his Shikuju from where it had remained planted into the ground throughout the whole fight. He never broke stride though, getting closer and closer to the man until Kakuzu's back was pressed up against the barrier, unable to retreat any further. The first desperate punch was easily diverted to the side by a swipe of his staff, and that was all Naruto gave him. "Arg!" Kakuzu cried out as the end of Naruto's staff slammed straight into his stomach, doubling him over as he crumpled against the barrier. "You are an old man, clinging on to past glories, never having properly experienced life, too wrapped up in your own greed." Slowly Kakuzu's eyes widened as the red bled away from his sclera, leaving them white for the first time in over 80 years since he had stolen the Jiangu technique from his home. "And I'll make you stop running from it." Slowly Kakuzu's body began to wither away, his skin losing its natural tan as it thinned and wrinkled. His hair changed from a dark brown to a snowy white as his eyes became sunken, spots appearing over his skin. What have you done to me?" His voice had lost its deep commanding edge, becoming friendlier and weaker. It looked as though the man had aged a few decades in a few seconds. Even the threads that stitched his body together slowly vanished, turning to a dark dust that retreated back inside his body, probably reforming the organs and muscles that had been broken down in his life-extending technique. "I took away your chakra, the technique you were using has stopped, you're just an old man now." Absently Naruto heard the buzz of the barrier falling as it recognized his victory over Kakuzu, however he paid it no heed. "Now tell me about the Akatsuki." Haku breathed heavily, his breath visible in front of him as a wispy mist as he looked down at Taiyuya's form. Her skin was pale, much paler than what should have been healthy, and little ice crystals had appeared all over her body. It didn't even look like she was breathing, her chest rose so slowly, but even so Haku couldn't help but let out a small choked laugh, a single tear sliding down his porcelain skin. He had saved her. He still wasn't entirely sure how the stupid, reckless, idiotic thing he had done had actually worked, but it had. He hadn't even really known what he was doing, his body moving purely on instinct as he used a medical technique designed to give chakra to a patient. Except he had gone against all convention when instead of using the special healing Iryo chakra, he had instead used his own Hayatan chakra. It wasn't exactly freezing Taiyuya, that would have had catastrophic effects on her body as the water in her cells expanded, but it did slow her body's metabolism right down to the point where her blood barely even flowed anymore. He cringed as he knelt back, a small smile stuck on his face. It had taken a large amount of his chakra to completely replace Taiyuya's, and it would still only buy him a few hours at best. He needed to get her to Naruto. Right now he was the only one with a hope of saving her as she was now. There was only so much medical chakra could heal when there wasn't anything there to fix anymore. The puncture wound to her heart had completely ripped through it, the only reason she hadn't actually died was because of her lowered metabolism, meaning her organs didn't need oxygen for the energy they weren't using. Unfortunately for him, he was now trapped inside the barrier with an Akatsuki member. He couldn't have performed the procedure outside of the barrier where his chakra was suppressed. Hell, he had nearly blown out a few of his tenketsu just making that one ice mirror to even get it. Even then he had taken advantage of the barrier, recognizing Tayuya as dead, to get in just as it came down. Unfortunately now there were two alive contestants inside. It had sealed right back up again. Come out, girlie. You took my sacrifice from me, so you'll have to repay it with your blood. Hayden's voice echoed through the trees near where Haku had hidden Tayuya. He breathed out again as he stood up. The only way out of here was through Hayden, and that meant the only way to save Tayuya was to take the Akatsuki member out as fast as he could. His eyes hardened as an ice mirror congealed below him. His chakra was low from what he had done to Tayuya, which only hardened his resolve to end this quickly. Hayden slashed through another tree, scowling his annoyance that his sacrifice got away. Even now he could feel her through the bond he had created, even if the technique had ended. Her heartbeat infuriatingly sounding in his mind as the girl refused to die because of whatever that other girl had done to her. He roared out his anger as another tree was felled by his scythe, looking around furtively for any sign of them. However, he paused in confusion as he rounded another tree only to see himself. No, it was his reflection in a large mirrored panel jutting up from the forest floor. It looked as though it was made from a block of ice, yet had the perfect reflective surface of a real mirror. He approached it slowly, looking at his own reflection before grinning, noting the large amounts of blood covering his body. "Hey there, handsome, how you arg?" The silver-haired Akatsuki cried out in pain, spinning around with his scythe bared only to pause in confusion again. In front of him, yet again, was himself, or to be more accurate, another ice mirror had sprung up behind him, showing him the large bloody gash on his back that was slowly healing over. However, even as he gawked at himself, he cried out in pain again, this time as a large slice appeared down his left arm faster than he could spot just who did it. Just like the last time, when he turned to attack his opponent, there was simply another mirror, reflecting back his infuriated features. Normally, I don't like violence. The voice seemed to be all around Hayden as more ice mirrors slowly rose from the ground, encircling the Jashinist and caging him in. A normal man might have tried to escape before they could be caged in, tried to break through one of the forming mirrors only to fail as they found the chakra-infused ice too strong. However, Hayden had the arrogance of an immortal and simply stood his ground as more of his reflections sprung up. However, you hurt my friend, so I'll make an exception. Hayden just grinned as he readied himself for the oncoming attack. He could practically feel, just waiting for the right opportunity to wear down his opponent and get their precious blood. For him it was only a matter of time. However, his opportunity would never come. As he stood there, he suddenly cried out in pain as a long slash appeared down his back. Before he could even reach around to touch it, though, another appeared on his front, then his arms, and his legs. Before long, in probably what was only a few seconds, Hayden had been slashed so many times that there was more blood on his skin than there wasn't, and for once it was all his own. "Arg, damn it, you bastard, show yourself, coward!" Hayden panted, noticing his wounds appeared to be healing a lot slower than usual. Not only that, but it was getting a lot colder around him. The attack stopped for a moment before a figure appeared in the mirrors, all of them at once. Haku now wore his porcelain mask over his face again, casting a chilling image, the last Hayden would ever see as the man grinned. He rushed forward, scythe raised to slam into one of the mirrors bearing the ice wielder's image. However, as he ran, it fell limply from his hand as a small senbon of pure ice lodged itself through his forearm, robbing him of movement in that limb. "Ha, this is nothing, you little punk." However, before he even finished the last syllable, the more ice senbon joined the first, completely tearing away Hayden's control over his limbs and causing him to slump to the floor on his knees. "Damn it, once Kakuza gets here and gets these damn shards out of my arms, I'll kill you, you hear?" Haku stepped out of the mirror in front of Hayden, his eyes frosty behind the slits of his mask. "No, you won't, now disappear." Hayden couldn't even scream as his entire body was engulfed in ice, freezing him permanently in place. Haku breathed out a long, steamy breath as the mirrors all melted away around him. He felt weak from the loss of chakra, but he had enough to go on. He had to protect Tayuya. Absently he cast one last look at the frozen Akatsuki member, stuck there forever like a living statue. Heal from that. Chapter 75, Clouds 13. Naruto stepped back from Kakuzu's withered form. The man was propped up against a tree breathing heavily. Apparently having his body suddenly catch up with around 70 years of aging all in one go was a stressful process. Naruto ignored the now aged Akatsuki member for the moment, a troubled frown on his face as he thought about what he had learned. However, as concerning as the information was, he still had to deal with the problems he had right now. His head snapped up though when he heard the faint buzz of the barrier coming down. He could actually see the glyphs and symbols of the kanji begin to change as it recognized his victory. Before his window of opportunity closed though, Naruto slammed his hand into the ground. Kochios. The area around him burst into clean white smoke that died away after a moment to reveal his friends. However, it took Naruto no time at all to realize something was wrong when Haku was carrying a far too pale Tayuya. Naruto. Haku immediately spotted his blonde friend after the mild confusion of going through a summoning. 1 minute he had been running with Tayuya in his arms towards Uzushio, assuming that was where Naruto would be. The next he was here. Haku. What's wrong with Tayuya? Naruto frowned as he gave a precursory glance over the redhead, not liking what he was seeing. She seemed to have multiple stab wounds all over her body, her skin was pale, and she hardly seemed to be breathing. Most worrying through was the hole in her chest that seemed to be emitting a constant trickle of precious lifeblood. Haku gently placed the girl down in front of the blonde, giving her a worried last look before standing back up to look at his friend. She faced an Akatsuki member. He had some kind of healing factor or something, I don't know. But he used a jutsu unlike any I've ever seen. I think it connected his body to Tayuya's because he stabbed himself through the heart, and now she's like this. Naruto blinked. He had never heard this kind of urgency in his usually stoic and quiet friend. However, he had to admit that had he not gone through Tsunade's training to remain calm and collected in situations like this, he may have been in a similar situation. Gently he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, never taking his eyes off Tayuya, and he needed to know the full extent of her injuries before he could do anything. Calm down, Haku, whatever you did to prolong her life is working, we have some time. Naruto could see the Hayatan chakra running through the girl's system. It was a foolish and makeshift idea, but it had at least worked as a form of stasis. Although had he been there, Naruto would have slapped Haku for attempting something so untested and reckless. He was still tempted, but there was a time and a place for scolding people. What happened here? Fu's voice cut in as the girl glanced about the destroyed clearing. Many trenches and craters littered the area, as well as more than a few broken or crushed trees, the obvious signs of a very intensive fight. There was that, plus the fact Naruto's robes were slightly tattered, and there was a particularly desiccated man lying against a tree not far from them. That's our other Akatsuki over there by the tree, don't worry about him. Fu just nodded, taking Naruto's word for it as she continued to glance about, marveling at the destruction a fight between Naruto and an Akatsuki could cause. How are you two so calm? Both Jinchuriki looked around at their friend with a little shock. He had descended to a knee next to Tayuya, and was staring up at them, his eyes a little red from tears. Naruto just smiled kindly as he crouched, placing a hand on Tayuya's shoulder. Don't worry, Haku, I once promised I would never let another friend die while I still had power to prevent it. If we aren't calm, we can make mistakes. We know how you feel right now, trust us. His voice was sincere and kind, and Haku felt a little of the tension on his shoulders relax, enough for him to suddenly rock back. He was exhausted and had been running on fumes since his fight with Haiden, and it was beginning to finally show as the adrenaline wore off. Come on, we need to carry on. I can't do anything to help Tayuya while my chakra is suppressed like this. I only had time to summon you guys before the barrier came down. Now that his fight was over with Kakuzu, he was under the effects of the island-spanning seal again. We need to find somewhere that's out of its area of effect. He looked toward the center of the island with narrowed eyes. I'll bet that's in Uzushio. After all, it made little sense for a village of shinobi and chakra-sensitive people to restrict themselves in their own home. Thankfully, carrying Taiyuya proved to be little issue even with Haku exhausted and only barely able to walk. Naruto may have been prevented from expelling his chakra in any useful way, but techniques that were purely internal like Tsunade's strength were still fully accessible. The girl was light as a feather as he gently carried her bridal style. If Fu was at all jealous of the position, she wisely kept it to herself as the group moved swiftly towards the center of the island. 1 or 2 times they came across the barriers, but with Naruto able to spot and see them, they could skirt around Hiroto's commandeered arenas. However, it wasn't all that long before they came across a new problem in the form of an enormous wall that seemed to span the entire circumference of the village. That wasn't the problem though. The wall itself was shattered and broken, evidence of a long siege against its stoic facade. The problem was the massive barrier array that stuck to the wall like a second skin, not crippled with holes and damage like its material counterpart. All along it, Naruto could spot those same lightning-containing seals that mocked him, daring him to try and absorb the barrier's chakra. He knew the only thing that would get through this barrier was excessive force, the kind entire villages could muster with platoons of shinobi. Damn it. Haku collapsed onto his knees after being informed of their latest obstacle. Their situation just continued to seem hopeless as problem after problem was thrown their way. Naruto simply frowned as he walked up to the barrier. He traced his hand along it lightly and watched the floating kanji twist about his hand, unfortunately not letting him through though. Probably only a true Uzumaki can get through it. Gently he set Taiyuya to one side as he continued to scrutinize the barrier, looking for a way to get through or bypass it. Hiroto obviously wanted them to proceed into Uzushio for whatever he was planning, so there had to be a way through it. Maybe it was just a matter of waiting for his annoying projection to show up, ramble on about inner selves, or some other narcissistic nonsense before he grandiosely allowed them through the barrier. Then again, maybe. Gah. Naruto blinked as Haku suddenly got to his feet, an icy expression on his face as he charged the barrier. Throwing all his weight behind it, he crashed into the unyielding shoulder first. No more waiting, we have to save her. Undaunted by his failure, the boy simply took a few steps back before charging the invisible wall again, letting out a small grunt of frustration as once again the barrier refused to submit to him. He was about to charge it again when he felt a strong hand grip his shoulder. Turning, he saw Naruto's blonde mop of hair as the monk looked at the barrier, seeing what Haku couldn't with his rippled eyes. You know that isn't going to work, Haku, there's no use exhausting yourself over this. The darker-haired boy seemed to lose all his energy at that, his shoulders slumping, and his breathing becoming a little heavier. But he wasn't sure how to finish that, staring up at the invisible wall that prevented them from moving on. With every minute it held them up, Taiyuya's chances of surviving grew slimmer and slimmer. Maybe that was what Hiroto wanted. He obviously was aiming to whittle down their numbers with these seemingly pointless games and fights. Taiyuya would just be another number to him. Haku's eyes hardened again at that thought, angrily slamming his hand into the invisible barrier, still a little slick with his friend's blood. Come on. Naruto looped his arms around his friend's shoulder, seeing as with that last little act of frustration the energy truly left Haku. However, amazingly, as Haku pulled his hand away, a sticky red imprint of it was left floating there, seemingly on nothing but air. Naruto caught it out of the corner of his eye and turned, watching with slightly widened eyes as the kanji around the handprint of Taiyuya's blood pulsed excitedly before changing to an energetic green. Before the blonde's eyes, the bloody handprint was slowly absorbed into the barrier, as the invisible wall itself slowly fell, leaking away in a large gate-like opening. Wow. It was incredible to watch as the shimmering wall of light slowly evaporated away, leaving a space large enough to fit an entire group of people through. However, the edges of the opening were wavering slightly, so before Haku could even figure out what was going on, the blonde had slung him over his shoulder. He dashed across and grabbed Taiyuya, but more gently, and nodded at Fu as the mint-haired girl wordlessly followed him through the barrier in twin bursts of speed. Behind them the gaping hole slowly shrank until the invisible wall was once again complete and impenetrable again. What just happened? Haku was confused as Naruto jogged over to a nearby building that was in at least decent shape, putting both his quarries down on the dusty stone floor. He couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief as he felt chakra flood his body again like a warm soup on a cold day. Even Haku seemed to notice the change, gaining enough of his energy back to stand up and glance back towards the hole in the great wall they had just passed through. I'm not entirely sure. Naruto looked back as well, noticing that from the other side the floating kanji of light that made up the barrier seemed a little dimmer. But I think Taiyuya's blood deactivated the barrier, at least for a short while. Haku frowned as he looked down at the redhead's almost peaceful face. But then does that mean? Naruto just nodded, also glancing down at the now infinitely more mysterious former Oto Kunoichi. Yeah, I think Taiyuya might be an Uzumaki. She must not have known though obviously, after all Naruto hadn't made his own last name secret so something would have come up there between them. But how? Naruto simply waved the boy off as his face became more serious, crouching down beside Taiyuya and lighting his hand up with green chakra. No time for that, we'll have plenty of time after we've healed Taiyuya. Haku just blinked his shock before nodding dumbly, still a little dazed from his exhaustion and the entire situation. Alright. Naruto just nodded absently, not even registering the boy said anything as he completely devoted himself to what he was doing. He ran a green-lit hand up and down the redhead's body, checking for anything and everything that would need to be healed in order to stabilize the girl, starting with the chest wound. Haku glanced up worriedly as Naruto hummed and thought, his eyes focused on the girl, but he didn't disturb him. As good as Haku was at healing, Naruto had been trained by Tsunade directly. Right here he was the healer and Haku was just the inexperienced onlooker. However, with every frown that creased Naruto's brow or thoughtful hum that seemed less hopeful than Haku would have liked, the ice wielder grew more and more worried. Finally, though Naruto looked up, the green glow from his palm fading, Haku felt like melting into a small, relieved puddle as a smile lit up Naruto's face. You don't need to worry anymore, Haku, Taiyuya will be fine. The blonde stood up, clasping his friend's shoulder with that same warm smile lighting up his face. You did great, Haku, if it wasn't for you she really would have died back there, as it is now she'll be fine. Naruto left out the fact that a large reason why Taiyuya was still alive was because she had taken the injury with nature chakra still filling her system, and that had done a lot to lessen the damage, but he knew his friend was in a fragile state of mind right now, and needed all the cheering up he could. Fu, come on, I'll need you to work off the slight damage the ice will have done to Taiyuya's system, and safely get her metabolism back up again. The mint-haired girl simply nodded, already tying her hair up as Tsunade had instructed her to when dealing with complex operations. Now that the imminent danger had passed, Haku sat down wearily against a shattered wall, looking up at the sky as Naruto and Fu began making preparations. However, after a few moments, curiosity finally got the better of him. What exactly are you going to do? Naruto looked across, having been cleaning his hands by condensing water around them. It was something he had learned from Shizuku's memories. We're going to induce a mild form of Tsunade-sensei's mitotic regeneration. It'll grow back the damaged or missing tissue by replicating cells that are already there. However, instead of her full body technique, we're going to localize it to her wounds to reduce the impact it would have on her lifespan. Haku just nodded, understanding only a little of what Naruto was talking about. He had never felt more envious of the boy's tutelage under the famous medic Nin than he did right then. It sounds complicated. Naruto simply nodded as he continued to scrub his hands. Taiyuya's main risk right now was bacterial infection from her open wounds, and while Fu would be dealing with that as Naruto dealt with the wounds themselves, he didn't need to be adding to her concerns. It is. Normally it would take something like Tsunade-sensei's Yin seal to accomplish, both for the enormous amounts of chakra and the splitting of it into Yin energy. However, I can do both of those things myself. It's going to take some time though, so I can take it slow. If I do something wrong, the new cells could easily become cancerous and divide too much. Haku just nodded again, wisely keeping his mouth shut and allowing the two more competent medics to do their work. In the meantime, he took glances out of the building they were taking shelter in, trying to catch a glimpse of Uzushio from where they were. It couldn't be far from here. As Naruto worked, he couldn't help but feel like there was something wrong. However, he did his best to put it from his mind so it wouldn't distract him. Haiden remained in the clearing Haku had left him in, his body covered in a thin layer of ice that wouldn't break or melt even under an A-ranked fire ninjutsu. To the side of him, the air began to warp and twist almost as if a small whirlpool of air had opened up, rather appropriate for Yuzu no Kuni. A moment later and a single figure was standing there, his Akatsuki cloak gently fluttering in the breeze. His world orange mask with the single eye hole on the right side turned to the frozen Jashinist, observing him calmly even as the effects of Uzushio's seals became apparent on his body. Interesting, it is just like you said, I cannot expel my chakra. Slowly Black Zetsu rose from the ground beside the man, making sure not to fully emerge or risk being caught in the seal's effects as well. As long as he was still partially connected with nature, he could use the mayfly technique to get away, regardless of his chakra being externally blocked. Then it is a good job your spacetime technique does not rely on externally controlling your chakra. The orange-masked man simply nodded before walking over to the frozen Akatsuki member. How interesting, it appears they have a Yuki amongst them, or the Kyubi Jinchuriki has somehow managed to combine elements and form Hayatan chakra. Though that's unlikely, yet I could have sworn the Yuki had been wiped out in the Kiri Civil War though. They were too dangerous to be left alive after all, and I'm looking at perfect evidence for that. His voice was deep and low, but it held a curious edge, like a scientist discussing an experiment with a colleague. He did a once-around of the frozen Jashinist before smirking underneath his mask. This really is interesting. Haiden's immortality always was a point of interest for me. I would so love to thaw him out to see if he could survive through having every cell in his body burst after the water in them expanded as ice. That was if I didn't end up shattering him by accident. I can sometimes be so careless when I work after all. Black Zetsu simply stayed to the side and watched in interest as the man took a hold of Haiden's left arm. With a swift movement he slammed the side of his palm into it, shattering the ice and completely detaching the Jashinist's forearm from the rest of his body. In any case, I will be taking the ring back. You have no need for it now after all. It was almost as if the man was talking to the statue of a man, unaffected by the fact he was now holding a severed arm. After a moment or two though, it seemed to disappear in a swirl of displaced air, seemingly sucked into the dark eye hole of the enigmatic orange mask. A moment later the man followed in a similar fashion, leaving Haiden exactly where he was, still perpetually frozen in place, sans his left arm of course. Kakuzu wheezed slowly, making his third attempt at standing up from where Naruto had left him against the tree. However, his weakened, frail legs wouldn't support him yet, and he only slid back down the tree uselessly. He would have cursed his frustration if he wasn't so ashamed of how weak and pathetic his elderly voice sounded. It was even worse because he couldn't access his chakra, just like the brat had said. It was like he was suddenly cold inside, void of something drastically important. Pathetic. The air warped next to the frail man as Toby stepped out of his technique, touching down on the ground without a single sound. To allow a mere child to do this to you, to leave you in such a state? Kakuzu looked up at the new arrival, blinking his confusion as he stared up into the darkened eye hole of the bright mask. Toby? The masked Akatsuki member didn't even seem to hear him, simply staring at him coldly. I had thought you would put up more of a challenge. I even had a small hope you would win, but here you are, finally showing your true age after all this time. Kakuzu was confused. In the Akatsuki, Toby always had a bright, cheerful, and higher-pitched voice. Now it was deep, darker, and even foreboding in a way. It was unsettling how different the enigmatic man seemed. Oh well, in the end you served the purpose you were set. Now tell me about the Kyubi Jinchuriki. Kakuzu could only stare uncomprehendingly up into that dark hole in the mask, seeing past it to the glowing red eye it hid, complete with 3 encircling tomo that began to spin lazily. He became lost in those spinning tomo, as their rotations grew faster and faster until finally his world became dark. In the final stop on his trip, Toby once again reappeared, this time in the burnt and scorched landscape of Fu's battle, staring down dispassionately at White Zetsu's limp form. He simply stared for a few moments, noting the absence of the ring on the humanoid's hand as his own hand curled into a fist. He looked around, observing the damage and trying to glean what he could about the Nanabai Jinchuriki's abilities from the aftermath of her fight. This place truly is cursed. I can see why he warned me away from this place. The masked figure sighed, giving another glance to the fallen Zetsu with a single narrowed eye. Another ring lost, and I can't even be certain why. Why? He grunted, looking up at the sky in irritation. Just being here and knowing his chakra was locked like this was aggravating. It made him feel weak, and that infuriated him. No wonder he had always spoke about how annoying the Uzumaki could be. Finally he controlled himself, letting out a deep breath as his hand unclenched, his eyes becoming cold as a smirk crossed his hidden features. Well, we can't be down a ring like this, it's too inconveniencing. A chuckle escaped his lips as he gave a small nod thoughtfully. It was about time I paid a visit to a certain snake anyway. With that the man simply disappeared in a vortex of displaced air, vanishing as if he had never been there at all. So, she's stable? Haku's voice quivered with emotion like it never had before, as the young Yuki stared hopefully over Naruto's shoulder at Tayuya's still body. Fu still knelt by the girl's side, keeping a careful watch over her now slowly healing injuries. However, her skin had regained some of its natural, tan hue, and her breathing was regular and normal. Naruto stood in front of him, wiping his hands with a small, happy smile of his own. Yeah, Tayuya's strong, I knew she would pull through. Haku just nodded dumbly, never taking his eyes off the redhead as Naruto tossed the cloth he was holding to one side. But now that we know she's okay, we have to move on. Hiroto's still waiting for us in Uzushio, and who knows what that madman's been doing while we were here. Haku just nodded again slowly. Naruto wasn't sure he was even listening to what he was saying. Someone needs to stay with Tayuya, to keep watch over her, and make sure her injuries don't open up again. I was thinking. Haku's eyes suddenly snapped around to the blonde, alert and focused with determination. I'll do it. Naruto just smiled softly, a hint of amusement in his rippled eyes. I was going to say it should be Fu. She has more medical experience than you, and if something goes wrong wouldn't you feel better knowing she's there on hand? Haku paused, wavering a moment as his brown eyes flickered between the redhead and the monk. His head dropped slightly, one of his long bangs falling in front of his face. I still want to stay with her. I just need to. He was expecting Naruto to tell him otherwise, to stop thinking with his emotions like he obviously was. However, the blonde simply laid a hand on his shoulder briefly, already walking past him. I figured you might say something like that. He chuckled lightly, stopping when he was shoulder to shoulder with the darker-haired boy. You're pretty low on chakra anyway, even after that rest. Haku looked up, surprise evident in his features as he looked around. However, Naruto was looking right past him toward the ruins of Uzushio. Plus. His voice dropped to a whisper as the smirk on his face grew slightly teasing. I have a small feeling that your face would be the first thing she'd like to see when she wakes up. Haku gained a suddenly blush over the bridge of his nose, but he quickly recovered when he realized Naruto had carried on walking toward the village. Wait, you're not taking Fu. Naruto just chuckled, absently waving a hand as he walked off, not even bothering to turn his head. Like I said, I'd feel more comfortable with her tending to Tayuya. Tell her that, would you? Knowing her she'll try and run off after me. Haku just nodded as he lost sight of Naruto, the blonde disappearing down a hill. The Yuki never saw as Naruto's face lost its amused smirk, his features hardening and becoming set with determination. Naruto's Shikuju clicked with every step against the hard concrete beneath him, the rings jingling in time with the bell in his hair. He moved forward steadily into the darkness of the underground passageway, only occasionally lit by a candle bracket on the wall. He was right in the heart of the village, some distance below it as he followed the direction his water sense was telling him Hiroto was in. Even if he hadn't had the ability, though, Hiroto had left large, rather obnoxious signs pointing the way for him. Occasionally he would pass the symbol of the village inscribed on the walls, the once vibrant red paint cracked and peeling. The area he was in didn't seem too affected by the war that had ravaged the island nation, in fact it seemed relatively untouched by it. He would have guessed it was some kind of underground bunker-like area, possibly for storing supplies or maybe even for evacuation. However, he thought better of it when his senses told him this long corridor simply led to a single room, nowhere near massive enough to act as a civilian shelter or a storage room. Finally, though, he felt as though he would get some answers as he passed the final corner and walked into the rather large chamber, this time more brightly lit by bright glowing seals that lined the upper walls of the room. "Ah, there you are. We finally meet face to face at last. Please come in." Hiroto was there waiting for him, smiling brilliantly in his flamboyant white clothing as he raised his arms to the boy. However, Naruto paused in the doorway, his eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the ground in front of him, looking for seals that might act as a trap. He didn't see any though, which made him frown, while Hiroto's grin only grew. "Oh, come now, my Victor, don't be shy. Is it incentive? Is that what you need?" Naruto looked up in confusion until he saw Hiroto take a step to the side, revealing the tired and weary form of Anoka, chained up against the far wall, her head hung low. "Anoka." Naruto took a step forward to rush to the girl's aid, but unfortunately for him he fell straight into Hiroto's trap. The white-haired man suddenly slammed his hand onto the nearby wall and Naruto could see the chakra he was pushing into a suddenly lit-up seal there. Before he knew it, the ground underneath him came alive with light as a previously inactive seal sprung to life. The blonde could only manage to take one more step forward before intense exhaustion washed over him. His eyes widened as he felt his chakra being leached from him and into the large sealing array inscribed on the ground. Aha! Yes! The moment has finally arrived. Hiroto bounced happily on the balls of his feet as he turned to a previously unremarkable wall behind them. Black kanji seemingly snaked their way in from nowhere, circling and slipping over one another in great chains of symbols until one massive, complex sealing array had formed against the wall. It burned with chakra, Naruto's chakra to be precise. The blonde could see where his stolen chakra was being channeled as the massive array lit up. How? Naruto ground it out through gritted teeth, fighting the strain of having his chakra forcibly stolen. There was no sealing array here before. Hiroto turned to him, still wearing that beaming grin as he practically skipped over the blonde. "Of course there was my Victor." He said it tauntingly now in that chipper, victorious voice, mocking the downed blonde. Naruto was desperately trying to hold onto his chakra through his Preta path, but the seal on the ground was far too powerful. He had a feeling it would be possible in Sage mode, but his control was too messed up to even consider gathering Senjutsu. You simply couldn't see it because there was no chakra in it yet. The white-haired man mockingly touted a finger at the teen with a smirk. "You played your hand too early, my blonde friend. You let me know you could see chakra when you stared up at the barriers." He chuckled to himself as he turned back to the far wall where the new sealing array was pulsing almost expectantly. "On any other day those eyes of yours would positively fascinate me. It's not often you come across an entirely new jujutsu after all. However, today is my day. The day I prove all those half-brained idiots wrong." He laughed almost madly to himself as he walked back towards Anoka, lifting her chin with his finger, even thought the girl's eyes were dazed and unfocused from exhaustion. "They called me crazy. That Uzushio was nothing but a barren ruin picked clean years ago." He grinned to himself, however the expression was becoming more and more vicious as his hold over the redhead's chin grew tighter, causing Anoka to whimper. "I spent years picking through these ruins, copying and studying every dormant seal, every little inscription that hadn't been burned away or stolen. Then I found this place, hidden where no other prying eyes had looked yet, deep within Yuzu's heart. But it wasn't to be, I couldn't crack it, not as I was. So I studied. I learned. I mastered every seal I could find, but it still wasn't enough. He finally dropped Anoka's head, letting it fall limply back down with another small whimper. I was no Uzumaki. Their blood didn't run in my veins, so I couldn't access the island's defenses that I had so painstakingly put back together. He grinned though as he stood back up, looking down at Anoka and throwing his hand out dramatically with an extravagant flourish. But fate saw fit to hand me her. A real, breathing Uzumaki with their oh-so-precious blood running through her veins. He turned back towards the blonde, running back over with childish glee to skid to a halt just outside the draining seal's area of effect. From there it was only a matter of time before the island's amazing defenses were under my control. You experienced them yourself, the barriers designed to localize any fighting to specific areas where the rules could be changed to suit the Uzumaki fighting style. The chakra-suppressing seal that spanned the whole island to discourage invades passively, and the massive barrier array around the village itself, only respondent to the Uzumaki themselves. He grinned viciously as he turned back to the wall where the seal seemed to be finished glowing. But don't you see? That was only the tip of the iceberg of Uzumaki genius. This is their vault, buried deep under the village. It must contain their secrets. Centuries of sealing knowledge that can be mine to learn and control. He turned again, his cape billowing out behind him as he pointed dramatically at Naruto. You were the final puzzle piece. I needed someone with incredible chakra in order to activate the seal. Even this Uzumaki girl didn't have enough. He waved his hand at the chained girl, the reason for her exhaustion becoming apparent now, making Naruto scowl and try to lift himself up again. Oh, don't bother trying to break that seal beneath you, boy. You need Uzumaki blood to deactivate it, and I'm afraid the only supply of it around here, beside that remarkable girl you brought yourself, is right here. He pointed to Anoka as his smirk became crueler. But I don't think she's in any condition to lend some, do you? Naruto just growled again, straining against the seal's affects. However, he paused, looking down at a slightly shaking hand with wide eyes. Perhaps it wasn't like he had thought. Maybe his name wasn't just some randomly chosen last name. Tentatively he began to reach his thumb towards his canine tooth. Now. He was shocked out of his daze as Hiroto stood proudly in front of the massive sealing array, a kunai in his hand. Let's see what's behind the door. He reached over to Anoka and roughly grabbed her hand, quickly slicing across her palm and thrusting the bloody hand onto the sealing array. The massive sealing array pulsed even brighter in Naruto's eyes as the massive stone wall suddenly split, revealing an almost invisible seam that slowly widened, revealing the blackened room beyond. Chapter 76, Clouds 14. This is it. Hiroto almost screamed it out as the massive stone door ground open, sliding along invisible tracks with a great wrenching sound of stone scraping stone. Finally, with a tremor-inducing thump, they stopped, unable to go any further due to the walls perpendicular to the great earthen door. There was a moment of deafening silence in the room as both Naruto and Hiroto couldn't help but try and peer into the darkened room beyond, seemingly a great chamber slightly larger than the room they were already in. The blonde's curiosity overwhelmed him as he strained his eyes to pick up even the slightest detail in the darkened room. However, he needn't peer for long as a moment later long dormant seals slowly hummed to life, gradually illuminating more and more of the large underground chamber. Ever so slowly a massive library-like room was revealed, with shelves upon shelves of scrolls stacked up to the vaulted ceiling, with even more empty to receive more. You could practically feel Hiroto's excitement like an aura in the air as he took a trembling step forward on slightly shaky legs. This is it, the Uzumaki treasure I read about. It's finally within my reach. He hopped about excitedly from foot to foot before striding in more confidently, an ecstatic grin on his almost hysterical features. However, he paused when he heard a grunt of exertion from behind him, turning with an almost serious expression to see Naruto still straining against his invisible bonds as his chakra continued to be leached away. I won't let you." His voice was strained under the exertion of losing so much energy so quickly. However, now the seal was complete, and had all the chakra it needed. The draining of his own had lessened and become more tolerable. "Oh wow, you're still conscious and moving." Hiroto seemed genuinely curious as he observed the young monk. That seal, as far as I could tell, was designed to be used by 5 fully grown Uzumaki members, and it would still leave them drained. "You really are a chakra beast, aren't you? Even the famous Kisame Hashigake would probably be out of it from that seal, and here you are, struggling against it." He sighed, giving a dismissive wave as he turned away towards the room. "As fascinating as that is, though, like I said, more important things." With that he gave another extravagant flourish towards the library, and without another word rushed right in. Naruto sank back down, struggling to keep his shaking limbs under control as he fought to rein in his escaping chakra. Now that the seal had slowed in its leaching, it was easier, but by no means easy. His breathing was becoming ragged. Finally he just gritted his teeth, figuring he had little else to lose right now than that small childish glimmer of hope that had always resided in his heart over his true family. He quickly bit into his thumb before smearing his blood on the ground. For a few heart-rending moments nothing happened. However, just as that small ember of hope deep in Naruto's heart was about to fade entirely, it burst back into life as the seal glowed a welcoming green before fading entirely. For a few moments Naruto just lay there, panting as he felt his chakra stabilize. However, after another moment or two a bright, ear-to-ear grin split his face. He had family. The idea was just alien to him, but he had it, real, honest-to-blood family. However, his gaze darkened as he looked up, spotting the retreating form of Hiroto's cape walking into the now lit room beyond this chamber. That man was about to disturb something precious to his family. He wouldn't allow it. He staggered to his feet, his head feeling a little faint with the little chakra running through his body, little to him anyway. The chakra that was coursing through his pathways would have been enough for multiple average jounin with some to spare, but for him, used to almost bijou-level reserves at his disposal, it was like running on a near-empty tank. He walked forward, slowly regaining control of his body as he moved, eventually rounding the massive doorway to spot Hiroto standing by one of the shelves, one of his hands gripping the chain that still bound Anoka's hands together. No. Hiroto had an angry scowl on his face as he threw what appeared to be one of many scrolls to the side, onto a small pile of them next to his feet. "No, this isn't right. Where are the jutsu? Where are the sealing techniques?" He cast aside another scroll, letting go of Anoka's chain as he frantically began reading through scroll after scroll that he plucked off the shelf. Birth certificates? Marriage licenses? Who cares about this crap? Where are the techniques? Where is the treasure? He stopped, his eyes going wide, as he heard a slightly croaky chuckle from behind him, turning slowly to see Naruto illuminated in the doorway of the large library. "You idiot, don't you see?" Hiroto got over his shock quickly, too overcome by his rage at seeing the blonde still standing. He didn't even care that the monk had somehow managed to escape what should have been a foolproof trap. What did I possibly miss? He was spitting out the words in his frustration, the scroll he held in his hand beginning to bend from his tightened grip. Seeing that made the blonde frown. The Uzumaki obviously didn't care about techniques. What use are they to the dead? Their treasure isn't some ultimate sealing jutsu, it's family. Hiroto looked confused by that, dropping the scroll in his hand from his now limp grip. He blinked, looking around the massive room and all the scrolls contained within. Each was labeled with a name, imprinted proudly in bold kanji, so that the memories of those contained within would live on past the siege of the clan. It was no wonder this room was guarded above all others if this was what the Uzumaki were trying to preserve. No, it can't be. Hiroto shook his head, bringing a hand up to clutch his temple as he kept looking around, feeling each of those boldly imprinted names mocking him just like his colleagues had. It's some kind of trick. There must be seals on each of the scrolls hiding the real information. It's just to throw people off. He began laughing hysterically as he grabbed another random scroll off the shelf. the inscription reading Katsumi Uzumaki in proud black kanji. I just need Uzumaki blood, it solves everything. He spun, reaching for Anoka, however Naruto beat him to it, straining his weary chakra system as he raised a hand. Banzhou Tenin. Hiroto's hand closed on nothing but air as Anoka soared across the room, landing safely in Naruto's arms as the blonde continued to level a steely gaze as the white-haired man. It's over, Hiroto, there's nothing for you in this room. The white-haired man simply trembled in rage, the grip on the scroll in his hand tightening to the point where it just snapped in half, the delicate glass ends shattering and cutting the man's hand. It's not over yet. I just have to keep looking. The secrets of the Uzumaki will be mine. I've come to. He didn't get any further though as his blood dripped onto the floor, triggering a seal that reacted badly to the improper blood staining the ground. The dangerous kanji glowed an ominous red as Naruto's eyes widened, hand coming up to pull the man away from it. He was too late though, his tired arm not moving nearly fast enough as lightning suddenly sprung from all sides of the seal, centered on the white-haired man. His scream cut through the air as his body was burned and scorched from the intense electricity. By the time Naruto finally pulled the man out of the seal, his skin was reddened, and in some cases blackened from the incredible heat, and his limbs were twitching uncontrollably. There was a horrible stench of burned meat in the air, as well as the scent of ozone, and Naruto couldn't help but cringe as he set the now certainly crippled man to one side against a wall before doing the same with Anoka, channeling small amounts of his chakra into her to help her regain some energy. It seemed to work though as the girl managed to lift her head to look up at him, her eyes no longer unfocused or cloudy. Naruto. Her lips curled up into a small smile as she recognized the rippled orbs she was staring into, and were looking back at her, filled with concern. I told you we were family, I knew it. The young blonde smiled back as the girl's head lolled forward again, unconsciousness finally taking her. The blonde made sure she was okay again before finally standing back, holding a hand to his head at the sudden blood rush. It had been a very long time since he had felt quite this drained. Normally his chakra felt practically infinite. However, he got over it quickly. It was all over now and Hiroto had been dealt with, at least for now. The blonde looked over at the man, twitching occasionally from the intense electricity running through his body. Without medical attention he would probably die from his burns, his body going into shock and shutting down. However, Naruto wasn't entirely sure what to do. He walked over to the man, looking down at him as the victor. He would decide this man's fate, whether he lived or died. A large part of the blonde thought the man was undeserving, that he was the reason Tayuya nearly died and deserved the same fate. However, with a sigh the monk knelt down, his hand glowing green as he began to deal with the worst of Hiroto's wounds. Ultimately, it was not Naruto's place to decide who lived and who died like that. The man was defeated, he would get what was coming to him when Anoka recovered. If anyone got to decide the white-haired lunatic's fate, it would be her. After all, she had been his prisoner for possibly months. When he had dealt with the most life-threatening of his wounds, Naruto got back up, walking towards the library again, and taking another look around, a small lilting smile taking over his face. No matter what Hiroto had said, this room contained a priceless treasure. As Naruto let his hand drift along the many scrolls on the shelves, he knew that each name was a member of his family. Each name was a connection to something greater than him, and as he continued to glance at and ultimately memorize every single name in that room, an overwhelming sense of belonging rushed through his body. Finally he reached the far end of the room where a great mural was lovingly painted to the wall, still looking as fresh as the very first day it was drawn. It was an enormous spiral, circling and winding out from a center point, and occasionally along its length there was a name. As the whirlpool-like design got larger, it branched out more and more until at its edges it was a complex and intricate series of branching lines and names. With a start, Naruto realized it was one giant family tree, possibly containing every single Uzumaki that was documented in this room. Occasionally little symbols would be stamped next to certain names, other clans' insignias to indicate marriage out of the clan. There were a lot of them. Naruto just smiled as he traced the main branch of the whirlpool, as it slowly got thinner and thinner to accommodate more and more names. Somewhere in this mural was his mother, or his father, and in another life, his name might have been inscribed here as well. Slowly he managed to tear his eyes away from the history of his family, turning back to the small pile of scrolls Hiroto had so carelessly discarded to the floor. One by one he picked them up, replacing them on their respective shelves, until he came across the one the man had crushed in his hand. Carefully he unraveled it before grabbing a blank scroll from the end of the shelf, seemingly resting there for this very purpose. Slowly and meticulously he began to copy out the information inside to the new scroll so that none of his family would be forgotten. Uzushio may have been destroyed, but the Uzumaki were far from dead. The next week was one of recovery for everybody, in some cases physically like Taiyuya, and in others, emotionally, like Naruto. However, the entire island seemed to have a certain calm about it, the ruins once again returning to just that, ruins. However, as Naruto sat atop the remains of an old concrete building, tilting dangerously to one side, he couldn't help but feel like a new life had returned to his ancestral home. Hiroto had been locked away until something could be decided about him, but that was far from the young Uzumaki's mind as he gazed out at the ocean from his lofty perch. "Ryo, for your thoughts, cousin?" Anoka appeared by his side in a flicker of motion, settling down on the tilted rooftop with a small smile on her face. Naruto just returned the small gesture, still not quite used to the new way Anoka would address him. It was still just so alien to think he had an actual family. He knew the family he had built himself through his precious bonds was important, but the security of knowing that there were people out there that shared his blood in some small part was indescribable. "I was just thinking it'll be sad to leave this place. It really is beautiful when I try to imagine it as it used to be." Anoka's face turned down at that, her smile saddening as she followed Naruto's gaze out to the ocean where large whirlpools could be seen raging at random intervals around the coast. The blonde had learned from Anoka, who had succinctly learned about it from one of Hiroto's rants, that the whirlpools that gave the country its name used to be natural, until the Uzumaki harnessed them into a sort of initial defense. However, as their sealing knowledge grew, the need for the archaic defense mechanism became redundant. However, the whirlpools remained as an echo of the past. "So you're really going then?" Naruto nodded slowly, taking in a deep breath of the salty air. He wouldn't be able to smell it for much longer. Yeah, it's great knowing that after all this time and everything I've gone through I have a home I can return to if I wanted." He smirked, patting the dusty rooftop and looking around at the wrecked village. "And trust me, I'll be coming back here." He lost the smirk as his features became more pensive. "But there's still something I have to do in this world. Until I fulfill my purpose, it's not my place to settle down like this." Anoka still seemed saddened. Naruto wasn't the only one to have recently found out there was still a part of their family out there in the world, and she was remiss to let it slip by her. "But then, what's your purpose?" At that the smile returned to the blonde's face as he looked around, the sunlight from the afternoon sun catching his hair and lighting it up as he beamed. "I still don't really know, but I guess that's all just part of life." He chuckled to himself before letting out a long breath, looking back toward the ocean. "In any case, there are promises I made that still need to be fulfilled. I broke one once, and it nearly tore my heart apart. It's only thanks to my friends that it didn't. I never want to go through that again, so until I can secure peace for the people I care about, my purpose in this life has not been fulfilled." Anoka just stared at the monk for a few moments, enraptured by his passionate speech, before allowing a small, heart-warming smile to appear on her lips. "You know, I didn't know our family, just like you, but at least from what I heard from Hiroto, and from what I saw in the vault, I would like to think they would be proud of that dream." She leaned over, wrapping her arms around the slightly taller teen and hugging him tightly before standing up, giving one last glance around at the ruins of her home. "I can let you outdo me. I'm a proud Uzumaki too, so I'm going to do whatever is in my power to rebuild our home. I won't let another of our family go through what we did, so I'll make sure there will always be a place for us here." Naruto just nodded, a small unspoken bond forming between the two as they share their dreams. "I think our family would be proud of that as well, so I wish you luck in your path. I'll be back at some point to take my place in my home." Anoka just grinned, giving a small salute as she walked toward the edge of the building. "And I'll make sure there's always a place for you here." With that she dropped off the edge, leaving Naruto alone to his thoughts again. The blonde turned back to the sea, thinking about the last week and all the revelations it had brought to both him and the people he cared about. He would be moving on soon, like always did, but that didn't mean he couldn't savor moments like these while he could. Haku. Naruto waved his hand over to the darker-haired boy, noticing that Tayuya's eyes had begun to flutter, a clear sign she was close to waking up. The young Yuki flashed over so fast he was like a blur, immediately looking over Tayuya's body before settling for her eyes which were slowly opening. Ugh, damn, it feels like Jirobo was jumping on my chest. What happened? The young redhead slowly opened her eyes. The world was rather bleary at first, but a pair of concerned brown orbs were certainly clear to her. Haku. The ice user quickly nodded with a smile on his face as Tayuya blinked to clear her eyes and shook her head, peering up closer at the boy. Haku. The Yuki grinned as he nodded again, tears just beginning to percolate in the edges of his vision. Yeah, it's me, Tayuya. The redhead smiled weakly, reaching up a hand to touch the boy's cheek. Haku. Her smile suddenly morphed into a scowl, as the hand gently reaching up became a fist that squarely impacted with Haku's cheek, sending the boy reeling. You fucking idiot. To the side, Naruto, Fu and Anoka had large sweat drops hanging off the sides of their temples as Tayuya suddenly jumped off the bed, straddling Haku and grabbing him by the front of his kimono, shaking him comically. Why the fuck did you go and die, you shithead? She continued to shake the boy back and forth, causing swirls to appear in the Yuki's eyes. Tayuya. The girl finally stopped shaking the poor effeminate teen long enough to turn and glare at Naruto, her head still a little fuzzy from just waking up. What? The blonde flinched slightly at the powerful gaze until Tayuya blinked, realizing who she had shouted at, her eyes widening. Wait, so I'm not dead. Naruto shook his head quickly and a small smile began to spread over the redhead's face. However, he gulped as it immediately turned into a frown, quickly morphing further into a scowl as she roughly got off of Haku only to stride over towards Naruto. The hell, Blondie? You revived me with that messed up reanimation jutsu? Am I a fucking zombie now or something? Naruto's sweat dropped again. Tayuya must have been really confused after waking up or something. However, he quickly put his hands up, taking a subconscious step backwards away from the seething former Kunoichi. No, I swear. Haku managed to freeze your body before you could die. We just healed you, no reviving at all. Tayuya paused mid-step, taking in Naruto's words before turning back to Haku, who had just managed to get up and dust off his kimono top. The redhead immediately gained a small bush over the bridge of her nose as she thought back to what she had at the time thought to be her dying words, although they appeared to be a little less dying now. Likewise, Haku seemed to be a little flustered as the two moved closer together, a faint trace of pink dusting his cheeks. Well, thanks, I guess. From the side, Anoka leaned over to Naruto, unable to tear her eyes away from the unfolding drama. Has your friend always been this tsundere? Naruto just turned to the girl, clearly confused. What's a tsundere? Anoka just waved him off as she continued to watch the two blushing teens. Never mind. They both turned back as Tayuya finally seemed to work up her nerves, red now more predominant on her face as it slowly worked towards the shade of her hair. Well, that shit I said. I thought I was dying and, I dash. However, the girl's eyes went suddenly wide as Haku ducked in, stealing a small kiss from her while she babbled. However, after a moment or two her surprise gave way to acceptance as her eyes became lidded, and she leaned back into the intimate gesture. After another few moments, Anoka coughed awkwardly into her hands and Tayuya's eyes snapped open again as her hand reached up to smack Haku right in the cheek. The boy staggered back, hints of confusion in his chocolate orbs as he looked at the now heavily blushing girl. That was for freezing me, you idiot. It was stupid and fucking reckless. She hesitated for a moment before leaning back in and kissing the pale-skinned boy on the same cheek tenderly. And that was for saving me, I guess. Over on the side of the room, Anoka now had hearts in her eyes while Fu and Naruto exchanged a brief glance before leaving the room, dragging the other Uzumaki with them before she pounced on the new couple. Naruto smiled at the memory. Ever since the island, Fu and him had been wondering when their two friends would finally work up the nerve to confess how they properly felt to one another. Naruto might have even placed bets with Fu if he wasn't a monk. After all, they weren't subtle about it, even if the other seemed completely oblivious. The blonde wondered if that was what the whole tsundere thing Anoka was taking about meant before quickly shaking that out of his mind. The week had been filled with heartwarming moments like those, especially now that Haku and Tayuya were finally open about their feelings. So what, I'm an Uzumaki because my blood deactivated some barrier seal here. Naruto nodded, backed up by Anoka. The three of them were sitting in a quiet, relatively sound building that was only missing its roof. But I mean, this place is pretty fucking huge. The Uzumaki had to have other clans or families living here, right? I might just be related to one of them. Naruto could tell the girl was desperately trying to deny it in her own mind. Different people took life-altering news differently, and Tayuya was just so used to the concept of having no kind of real family that the knowledge she was wrong was too much for her. Actually, the Uzumaki were well known for their red hair. It's very likely you were related to them. Anoka spoke with a grin on her face, happy to convince the other girl that they were family. Naruto just ran a hand through his very much blonde hair with a slightly disappointed frown. Tayuya frowned as well, the options for not believing this becoming slimmer and slimmer in her mind. So that would make you guys my cousins or something, right? Naruto and Anoka nodded, the latter with an excited grin on her face. It's great. We could be anything from direct cousins through our parents to very distant relatives that probably would never have spoken to one another even if Uzushio hadn't been destroyed. I think it's exciting not to know. It means we aren't constrained by what we are to one another, we can just be family. Naruto smiled thoughtfully at that, not having considered it but rather liking the idea. Tayuya just looked down, her brow furrowing from her own thoughts. So what does that change then? Tayuya seemed genuinely confused by all this, and Naruto knew it must be hard on her. Once the adrenaline had left his system, it had hit him particularly hard as well. It doesn't have to change anything, to me you're still just Tayuya, except now I can call you family as well. On the other hand, it could change everything. We aren't just nameless outcasts anymore, we have a home to always go back to, or to ignore entirely as just a ruined island, people to count on thanks to blood, or to treat the exact same way. It's up to you. With that, the young monk stood up, placing a firm hand on Tayuya's shoulder before walking out, his shikuju clinking with each step. He paused outside though with a wince as he heard Anoka immediately rush over to Tayuya, badgering her new cousin with a multitude of questions. The blonde just quickened his pace, not envious of the former Otokunoichi's position right now. When Anoka wanted to talk, it was hard to get her to stop. The blonde was broken from his reminiscing as he heard the grunts and shouts of sparring break out somewhere below him. It was probably Fu and Tayuya going at one another again. Ever since the redhead had lost to Haiden, she had been particularly aggressive about sparring to shore up her strengths. She had even sucked it up and asked Naruto to help her, so he gave her tips on her taijutsu while she was in sage mode. The girl had a tendency to let the power of the nature chakra go to her head, sacrificing her technique for brute strength and power. It was effective when under the influence of senjutsu, but up against an equally powerful, or in Haiden's case unique, opponent it just wouldn't cut it. However, she hadn't been the only one to have been shown their weakness during this whole sordid affair. Haku had been shaken by his now girlfriend's near-death experience, and Naruto was sure he was off somewhere working on his speed or technique. Even Anoka seemed to be getting into it, although Naruto wasn't sure if she was serious or just happy to go along with the group. It was obvious the Uzumaki girl hadn't had many of what could be considered normal friend interactions, not that anything Naruto or his friends did could really be considered normal. In any case, it was a good thing, as the girl had been very easily beaten by Hiroto, and getting stronger could only be a good thing. Even Naruto was not exempt from all this. Fu ambled aimlessly through the ruins of what she assumed to be training grounds. It was hard to tell with the debris and various craters strewn about the village. She kept thinking about how Uzumaki Genin might train here, perhaps learning a new jutsu, or going over some sealing technique with their instructor peering over their shoulder, looking for any mistakes to correct. The mint-haired girl sighed. It always made her nostalgic to think that her own childhood might have been like that had she not been a Jinchuriki. Of course she probably would have never met Naruto, and such an idea for her now was almost unthinkable. She turned a corner only to come across a rather curious sight. In front of her, for about 100 meters, seemed to be a field where the laws of gravity ceased to exist. Small and large pieces of debris alike floated randomly through the air, as if they were celestial bodies not bound by the constraints of the earth. Right in the center of it all sat Naruto in a deep meditative state, his eyes closed and legs crossed with his hands upwards, knuckles together. Naruto. Fu tried to reach the meditating blonde, but she got no reply, even though she knew that at this distance Naruto should have been able to hear her. She figured he must be talking with his tenants, which also meant he most likely wouldn't wake up anytime soon. With a small shrug, Fu stepped into the null gravity field, immediately feeling strange as weight ceased to have any meaning for her. She tried to put her foot down, but all it succeeded in doing was pushing her away from the ground. For a moment she just twisted about in the air, confused and disoriented. However, she got her bearings after a moment and grabbed onto a large chunk of a building that was floating nearby. With a shove she pushed herself towards Naruto, the debris floating off until it was out of the field, where it promptly fell back to the ground with a crash and a small plume of dust. The mint-haired Jinchuriki floated lazily through the air, actually rather enjoying the feeling of being weightless like this. Occasionally she would have to push off another floating rock as air resistance slowed her down, or navigate around some debris, but she soon reached where the blonde sat. She dropped gracefully to the ground as she reached the small 2-meter radius circle where gravity existed again. Fu gently tapped Naruto on the shoulder, waiting a few moments before the boy finally opened his eyes, the debris that had been previously suspended falling to the ground in a cacophony of noise and dust. Naruto blinked a moment before looking up with a smile. "Hey Fu, can I help you?" The girl blinked before pointing to the west, where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. "We were about to eat." She looked around, observing the now gravity-occupied clearing. "What were you doing out here?" She gave him a quick look before he could give her the obvious answers of meditating or training, and the blonde wisely rethought his next words. "I was trying to see if I have reached my peak with the Rinnegan." Fu raised a curious eye but allowed the monk to continue. "I need to know if this is it, if this is all I am able to do. Depending on the answer that I find, I have one of two options: either continue seeking further power from my eyes, or learn something new." Fu just nodded, joining Naruto where he sat. "And?" She was curious now, so food could wait. However, Naruto just gave a shrug. "I'm not sure. So far the abilities of my Rinnegan have only presented themselves in dire situations or through intense training. When I think I have reached the limits of a technique, I suddenly find there's a new one, like an expanding puzzle in my mind that I am only beginning to collect pieces for." He raised a hand and a nearby piece of debris floated into the air, as the gravity around it was suddenly reversed. "Learning to make things lighter was one of the first things I learned, but it was only after Sora suggested it that I tried making them heavier." He clenched his hand and the rock fell to the ground much faster than it should have, leaving a small crater. "Maybe you should do both?" Naruto smiled at that, glad for the input. He shook his head though. With enemies like the Akatsuki, he couldn't afford to spread out his training. It would be better to master his own abilities than try learning something entirely new if it wasn't necessary. "Well, I'm sure it will come to me given a bit of time." He grinned, getting up from his cross-legged stance and offering his hand to Fu, who gladly took it. "Now come on, I'm hungry." The two walked off back to where the others had taken over Hiroto's old camp. Naruto knew that as long as he had his friends with him, an answer would always come in its own time. Chapter 77, Ember's Eye. Naruto stared out over the glittering waters that marked the natural boundary of Yuzu no Kuni. Over in the distance he could just about spot the violent edge of one of the island's many whirlpools. He thought about it as he watched the waters swirl. the endless currents pulling and tugging in a myriad of directions yet ultimately leading up to the same converging point at the center. It was very representative of life. It could take any number of paths or turns, and you could struggle until your last breath, but the end result would always be the same. It would only take the most remarkable, or valiant, or even luckiest of beings to escape the swirling vortex out into the calmer, peaceful waters surrounding it. The blonde chuckled lightly, wondering when he had become so pensive that he had almost begun to contemplate the cycle of samsara itself. He supposed it was only appropriate given what his eyes represented, and were named for, paths included. He sighed as he turned, feeling a hand rest lightly on his shoulder as he smiled at Fu, the two of them turning to face Taiyuya, Haku, and Anoka. You know, I really hadn't expected this. Despite the slightly saddened tone to the blonde's voice, he had a small, happy smile on his face regardless. I always knew our paths would have to diverge at some point, just not so soon. The news that Taiyuya wanted to stay in Uzushio with Anoka to help rebuild their family had come as a great shock to both Naruto and Fu. Then the fact that Haku would be staying with her, to see where their newfound relationship would take them, while less shocking, was no less upsetting for the pair. Hey, it's hard for us too, you know. Despite her best attempts at acting unperturbed by the whole situation, there was the smallest of cracks in the normally volatile redhead's voice. Haku simply nodded, his eyes still projecting that same saddened, melancholic expression he had worn since deciding to stay. Choosing between his friends and Taiyuya wasn't as hard as he might have expected, but it was still a choice he would rather not have made. He had been genuinely happy traveling with the peaceful, but optimistic blonde and stoic, but warm Verdette the past 3 years. While he was sure he would continue to be happy with Taiyuya, it was still a difficult thing to say goodbye, at least for now. The ice user paused for a moment, his brow furrowing as he stepped forward, pulling first Fu, then Naruto into long hugs. I owe you more than I could begin to repay, not only for saving my life, and for saving Taiyuya's, but for saving me from myself. You showed me that I really could live for myself, that my worth was greater than that of a tool, even though I do not regret my time with Zabuza for a second. He sighed, taking in one last look at the pair as the words struggled to reach his tongue. Like I said, I can't even begin to repay that debt, but I still want to thank you for everything. Naruto simply smiled at the boy, and even the edges of Fu's mouth quirked up a bit at the heartfelt words, showing more than enough for those that knew her. You shouldn't worry, you've more than made up for it simply being a friend to us. Haku smiled lightly even if he didn't look entirely convinced. To reaffirm his statement, Naruto quickly returned the friendly hug. He didn't make it too long though, for him it wasn't to say goodbye after all, he would be seeing his friends again. After that Haku seemed to quieten, unsure of what to say anymore, or even if anything more needed to be said. In the brief moment of pause, Naruto turned to Taiyuya, failing to keep the mildly expectant gaze from his features. The redhead simply looked back at him, her usual harmless scowl slowly creeping over her features. What? You expect some kind of pansy-ass goodbye or something? She huffed, having to look away for a moment to mask the slight catch in her voice. It was a small but noticeable voice in her head that whispered that in this world any goodbye could be one's last, a remnant of a harsh childhood full of disappointments and unfairness. Naruto just smiled at the girl, not having expected much else from the confident, independent young woman he had truly come to enjoy knowing over the last few years. He too knew the harsh realities of the world, but it was his quiet, hopeful optimism that kept him from shying away from open displays of companionship, without which he was sure he would have gone insane long ago. You don't need to say anything, Taiyuya, you can say anything you like next time we talk. It was short, abrupt and rather anticlimactic, just the way he expected a goodbye with the newfound Uzumaki girl. Therefore it came as a shock when he turned to walk away, feeling content with the farewells already said, when a slightly smaller hand grasped his own. Before he really knew what was happening, he was spun around and practically thrown into a rough, mildly awkward and unpracticed hug. For a moment his rippled eyes widened in shock and confusion, staring down the flowing red mane of his longtime friend's hair as he felt her arms squeeze him a little too strongly for a friendly hug. After only a tiny moment's hesitation, he wrapped his own arms around her in turn, feeling her body tense around the unfamiliar contact. It was over in a few seconds, the two pulling away from one another as Tayuya looked down awkwardly, not having thought much beyond the rather impulsive hug that had even taken her by surprise. However, for once that stubborn part of the redhead did not speak up, telling her to make some sarcastic remark. "Thank you, Naruto." Her voice was small and a little unsure, but she quickly covered it up as she managed to just about lift her head to meet the tall boy's eye, some more confidence entering her tone. "I mean it. For saving me, for freeing me, for giving me another chance, for allowing me a life I would have never dreamed of before, for opening up something." Her eyes flickered over to Haku in a split second, a brief movement that Naruto just about caught. "Something I couldn't have even imagined happening for me." She took a deep breath, seemingly collecting her thoughts after basically splurging whatever was on her mind. She wasn't used to being so open with her words like this, and to her emotions were things to be kept hidden, precious and personal. "It's all because of you, and like Haku, I owe you more of a debt than I could ever hope to repay in this lifetime." She chuckled with genuine mirth, her posture finally relaxing into something more recognizable of the normal redhead everyone had come to know. "But at the same time, I know you would never hold me to anything, even if I might never quite understand why." Naruto just nodded, a large, warm smile spreading over his features as he practically felt the glow of Tayuya's released emotion flowing through her words. After a few moments of silence, though, Naruto realized everybody was looking at him, expecting him to say something even though he wasn't entirely sure of just what to say to something so utterly heartfelt from the most unexpected source. I am not quite sure what to say. Like I said, I didn't expect this so soon." The blonde looked down, once again feeling that rush of sadness at the thought of parting from such good friends, people he had lived with for the past 3 years. However, when he looked back up, his features were firm in their warm, soft smile. "I never really knew what it was like to have friends or family before the temple took me in. Even there I received only a glimpse of a normal life I might have had." All of his friends looked down at that, each thinking of their rough past and their rocky starts in life. However, they each looked up as Naruto directed his gaze to them, first to Anoka, then Fu, then Haku and finally Tayuya. "Being with all of you is the closest thing to family I will ever have in this life, that I can guarantee you. So in a way, I owe each of you my own debt." Tayuya and Haku's eyes widened at that, and even Fu seemed a little surprised, each never having though Naruto felt that way, or at least so strongly. "However, I know I'm going to repay that debt someday, because this isn't the last time we'll meet." His smile grew a little, raising the general air of the small beach they were standing on. "So how about no more goodbyes, all right?" Without any warning, the Rinnegan bearer touched his hand to the ground, and in an enormous plume of smoke a great, drill-beaked bird stood before them, observing the group curiously with its own ringed gray eyes. In a flash, Naruto and Fu were atop it, precariously holding onto the black rod protruding from its back. "Take good care of Uzushio while I'm gone." He smirked fondly as he looked across as much of the island as he could one last time. "I'll hold you to your promise, Anoka." He had to shout the words as the enormous bird began flapping its wings in great, sweeping motions that had the 3 teens on the beach holding their clothes as they flapped in the sudden wind. "Wow, he really knows how to make an exit, doesn't he?" Anoka finally broke the silence that had settled on the beach, much to the mildly amused chuckle from Haku and Tayuya. "Are you really sure about staying? It must be amazing to travel with somebody like that." Both Haku and Tayuya sighed fondly, both looked out to where the small dot on the horizon finally shrank out of sight. Yeah, it was. The two had left Yuza no Kuni late in the morning, so the sun had already long passed its zenith in the sky by the time land could be seen below them. The great bird they rode on made lazy arcs through the air before coming to a surprisingly gentle landing in a thankfully barren field somewhere near the coast of the large island nation they had arrived at. Fu dropped off the summons first, thankful to be away from the strange drill-beaked creature. She was no stranger to flight, but this particular bird always sent a chill down her spine when it looked at her with its Rinnegan eyes. It simply unnerved her as they were a slightly different color to Naruto's own, a deeper metallic gray compared to his more vibrant violet. Ah, it's been a long time since we were here. The blonde dropped off the bird next, patting his massive summon when he landed despite the bird not even seeming to notice the contact, or even his presence beyond a quick glance. It was almost as if the bird was trying to ignore them, anxious to get away for some reason which was odd considering it should have simply been a construct of chakra created when Naruto needed a summon, no more free thinking than a shadow clone. It doesn't seem to have changed all that much. Naruto simply shrugged to his friend, looking around at the small, neat little forest they had landed in. They had caught glimpses of Nami no Kuni from the air and Fu was right, not a lot seemed to have changed, at least structurally. However, they were almost unprepared for the difference in the village, as they finally emerged from the forestry and onto the outskirts of the town they had stayed in those 3 years ago. Wow. The streets were bustling with life where before they were stark and empty, people too afraid to walk outside for extended periods in fear of being spotted by Gatta's thugs. In the same vein, the general sense of oppression that had existed amongst the populace was practically non-existent. If Naruto hadn't been there to see the poverty and strife of the downtrodden people firsthand, he would have never imagined this little thriving community had ever been anything other than what it was now. It was simply and probably couldn't sum up the complete feeling of the nation, but the only way Naruto could really describe the change was happiness. I don't believe how much has changed. Fu just nodded, glancing around as various people flowed around them, chatting, shouting cheery greetings, and just generally going about their business. It seemed like a fairly mundane, normal street to most, but to the two that had seen all of this before and none of the in-between, it was like standing in a dream. Finally, a grin split Naruto's face as he began moving through the crowds, effortlessly slipping between jostling people as Fu followed behind him with ease. It took another few minutes, but finally they reached a familiar house in a peaceful forest glade that they remembered. Except not quite, as the wood was cleaned up and repainted, and the neat little flower garden that used to exist just outside of the homely porch had blossomed into a full bouquet of brightly colored flowers. A young dark-haired woman sat outside, a soft smile on her face as she worked through patching up what appeared to be a pair of brown workers' pants. Tsunami. The woman looked up quickly, a look of intrigue on her face as she regarded the two teens approaching her. The slight confusion in her eyes quickly vanished as she noticed the bright spiky yellow hair and familiar Shikuja traveling alongside an equally unique set of mint green bangs. Naruto? Fu? The three had gone inside and were sitting around the dinner table, which Naruto couldn't help but notice was new, a large improvement over the old, weathered one he remembered sitting around as a younger monk. He gently sipped from the tea Tsunami had graciously offered, and had to nod his head in appreciation. It was just as good as he remembered it. Tsunami just removed her apron, hanging it up on a nearby wall before joining them, that same perpetually soft smile still alighting her features. It is really good to see you two again, safe and well. Naruto nodded again, this time in appreciation of her concern. Did you two happen to get a look around the village before stopping by? Another nod, and Tsunami's smile only seemed to grow as she settled back, a content sigh escaping her lips. It's wonderful, isn't it? How much is different from back then. I even have fleeting moments where I forget those times entirely. Everything is just so much better now. Naruto took another sip before releasing a sigh of delight. It really was good tea. I could barely believe it myself. I could never imagine so much could happen in only 3 years. Was this really because of Gatta's death? Naruto may not have been around to see the small businessman get his throat torn out by a vengeful Zabuza, but he had at least found out that it happened while he was reviving Haku. However, for just a moment Tsunami's smile slipped a little, turning more melancholic. Actually, as bad as things were under Gatta's thumb, the man at least kept the nation economically stable. With his death people celebrated, but once the initial shock and reverie died away, we quickly begun to realize the country was now without leadership of any kind. We were poor already and just didn't have the resources to kickstart our economy. Naruto frowned at that, wondering just how intrinsically Gatta had worked himself into this country's workings for his death to completely destabilize it. However, we were lucky. The warmth returned to the woman's face. With the bridge completed, we were once again connected to the outside world, and a young noble from Hai no Kuni noticed the situation we were in. He gave a substantial donation to help us get back on our feet, and everything you see here today was a result of his kind actions. That took Naruto aback for a moment, but in a good way. Such selfless altruism was rare nowadays, and it was good to see. However, Tsunami quickly laughed, a delightful, tinkling sound. I'm sure he probably did it to raise his profile in the courts or some such. Naruto simply shared the laugh, secretly hoping that wasn't the case, ever the optimist. So where are Tazuna and Inari? Tsunami took a quick glance over to the brown work pants she had been repairing as Naruto asked before looking back, her soft smile back. Both are in Konoha at the moment, actually, working on the reconstruction job our nation was hired to help with. Naruto raised an eyebrow in confusion at that. Reconstruction? What happened? At that, Tsunami raised her own brown in surprise. You hadn't heard? It was very big over the recent weeks. Naruto just chuckled sheepishly, bringing a hand up to rub the back of his head. I was away from civilization for a while. You could almost say I was stuck on an island. Tsunami looked at the blonde monk oddly for a moment, sparing a glance over to Fu, who simply shook her head in moderate exasperation. Well, it seems Konoha was recently attacked. Naruto's head shot up at that, his hand freezing behind his head. Wait, attacked? By who? Was it the Akatsuki? The blonde may have been trying to sever those thin ties to his former home in his mind, but there were still innocent people there, people he didn't want harmed because the Akatsuki were looking for him. Tsunami just seemed confused by the outburst, but looked up and thought anyway. No, I believe it was a place known as Sorogakure that attacked them, apparently using some kind of machines that allowed them to fly. The woman chuckled lightly like she was sharing gossip between a group of young mothers. Then again, who can say what's rumor and what's the truth with all those fantastical things shinobi can do anyway? For all I know, some shinobi can walk through walls. Naruto simply frowned, thinking back to that group of flying men he remembered spotting on the boat journey over to Oni no Kuni. He had a feeling those weren't rumors at all. Supposedly they dropped explosives all over the village, and from what father told me when he came back on his last weekly break, it left a lot of the village damaged. She sighed, looking towards the picture on the wall showing their small family. At some point the ripped-out portion that held Kaisa's face had been re-added. Naturally, Inari just had to follow his grandfather, wanting to see a real-life shinobi village for himself, even if it was just to repair the buildings there. She smiled, looking up at the two and noticing how close they sat to one another with a knowing smirk. He really looked up to you two, you know. You made a large impact on him while you helped our nation. He may never become a shinobi, and I can only hope as much for my own sake, but many of his beliefs came from seeing how you both approached the world. She chuckled again, wiping a small imaginary tear from her eye as she looked out the window to where the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon. You should see him, acting stoic and mature around the girls. She gave a poignant loom at Fu, yet on the inside he's the same kind and caring little boy Kaisa raised him to be. At that, even Fu smiled lightly, remembering the slightly irritating little boy that had constantly tried to attack her with a wooden kunai she herself had given him. I'm glad to hear it. Tsunami smiled as she took another sip of tea before her eyes widened a little, realizing how long they had been talking. Oh, listen to me, just prattling on. Was there any particular reason you came to visit? Naruto simply chuckled and waved the woman off. After the hardship the nation had gone through, the dimple fact she could sit here and just talk without concern was a great thing. No, we were just passing through on our way to Aim no Kuni. Fu looked him with slight surprise, not having heard of this particular destination before now. She had, though. They were heading to Kaminari no Kuni to warn Kurabi of the danger Akatsuki posed. Naruto simply gave her a small glance, conveying that he would talk to her later about it in private. He had meant to tell her before, but it was a little difficult to hold a conversation with the high winds from riding atop his bird summon. Oh, I hear that country is rather isolationist. The woman looked down and thought, but it seemed that was really the extent of her knowledge on the little rainy country, and her bright smile was back in a moment. "Well, I suppose I should offer you to stay the night. It's the least I could do after all." Naruto was about to kindly decline the offer so as not to impose on the woman's hospitality, but surprisingly Fu beat him to it. "That would be very nice, thank you Tsunami-san." The woman simply beamed as she got up, already busying herself to get the rooms ready. Sometimes it just felt she had so little to do with the two boys gone, for her father could barely be considered a man with the childish way he acted. It would be nice to have some company for a short time. The blonde looked across at his companion confusedly until she gave a small, completely out-of-character wink, standing up to help Tsunami, and leaving Naruto just sitting there, trying not to gape in surprise. "So Fu's voice was so innocent that Naruto had to blink a moment as he stared at her, wondering what this stranger had done with his foe. After a moment he realized there had been one too many seconds of awkward silence, so he quickly joined her sitting on the cozy little bed with its crisp white linen sheets. Tsunami had apologized for the lack of space, but this was their only guest room. However, her voice had only contained a mischievous mirth as she left, leaving Naruto once again confused. Once again the stifling silence on the small room became apparent as Fu looked at the blonde queerly. "Ah yeah, I never got around to telling you guys. I had meant to when we were traveling so we didn't have to involve Onoka, but then Taiyuya and Haku stayed behind, and it slipped my mind for the moment." Fu simply patiently waited as he explained. "I talked to Kakuzu after we fought." Seeing Fu's questioning glance, he clarified, "The old man you found near me." The verdette nodded quickly. "He told me something troubling." He looked down at that, genuine concern on his features as the old Takinin's words played through his mind again. "It seems I am not the only one in this world who possesses the Rinnegan." He practically felt the sharp intake of breath from his friend as her orange eyes widened, wondering why he blonde had withheld something so important this long. "Isn't this a good thing? Maybe you could learn more about your abilities, or why you have those eyes. Isn't it something you wanted to know? No? Perhaps this person is family?" Naruto nodded slowly. In a way he could probably learn some of that from the man, but not under the circumstance Fu would expect. "The man who possesses the Rinnegan is the leader of the Akatsuki, a man named Pain." An oppressive silence fell over the room as Fu simply absorbed that information. "He's our enemy?" Naruto frowned, remembering how much he had thought about this in the quiet moments as they recuperated on Yuzu. "I don't know, but he is the leader of the group trying to capture the Jinchuriki. It feels more like an enemy of coincidence than anything else." "But is it really coincidence?" Fu looked around, her eyes burning vehemently. She loved Naruto, and anybody that was his enemy, reasons be damned, was her enemy too. Not to mention this man was after her for the very same reason. "What does that matter why he has the same Jujutsu? He is trying to kill us just to get at Chome and the Kyuubi. The fact he has the Rinnegan only makes him more dangerous on our end." At that she fell silent, struck dumb by her own words. It had taken a few moments to really sink in. All that power she had seen within Naruto, the overwhelming ability she herself could never hope to achieve, was in the hands of somebody trying to kill them. There was also the fact this man was probably older than Naruto and much more experienced with his own Jujutsu, with far less restrictions on how he used it if his goal was anything to go on. I just don't know." The green-haired girl looked back across, spotting the conflicted expression marring the blonde's features. She paused, her own expression softening as she realized how this must be affecting Naruto. Given that most Jujutsu were genetic traits passed between family, it was highly likely this pain was related to Naruto, yet the blonde would no doubt have to face him at some point, under less than friendly circumstances. She could see it was slowly tearing him up inside, and she knew why. Naruto needed to seek this pain, and while part of his reason may have been to understand any possible connection between the two, it was more to see how much of a threat he was to both him and her. The blonde had only recently found out just who his family was, reconnecting with not one but two of his actual blood relatives. To now find out that he had another, only for it to be his enemy, she couldn't imagine the turmoil running through the young monk's mind. So, instead of trying to understand, she attempted to help, gently reaching across and placing her hand atop his. Naruto looked up, broken from his thoughts by the soft contact to see Fu looking at him intently. However, before he could say anything, the mint-haired girl had reached across and swiftly stolen a kiss. If you keep thinking about it right now, it will only make you stress. You will lose focus and become less effective, and that will help nobody. Sometimes you need to focus more on the most important detail instead of all of them. It sounded slightly cold, more like what a jounin might say to their genin student, but Fu tried to convey as much of her warmth and concern over her words, and it just about seemed to work as Naruto's shoulders visibly relaxed. Fu took that opportunity to lean in again, this time extending the kiss as Naruto gently reciprocated, simply enjoying Fu's presence for the moment. He was a little disappointed then when the girl gently drew away, standing up to walk over to the door as Naruto watched on, eyes slightly lidded. Slowly and almost uncharacteristically teasingly, Fu closed the door behind her, turning back to face the now mildly confused blonde. He opening his mouth to say something, but Fu was already there, a hand against his lips to quieten him as a small, but increasingly red blush crept from the bridge of her nose down to her cheeks. "Do you remember what we were talking about before we were attacked on that ship?" Almost instantly Naruto's cheeks reddened to match Fu's. He had a good memory after all. Slowly he took a gulp, now starting to understand why Fu had insisted on staying here tonight instead of traveling into the night. "Fu, do you think that's..." Again a single finger was pressed against his lips as Fu gently climbed onto the bed, now straddling Naruto's lap as she stole yet another kiss from the teen. "Don't think about too many details, remember?" Her voice was practically a whisper as she pulled away, a soft smile on her lips and her eyes closed. I don't know a lot about these types of things, so we do whatever is comfortable, right?" Naruto found himself unable to do anything but nod, eliciting a further smile from the girl he was sure he loved. "Good." It was more of a breath than a word, but Naruto had little time to ponder it as in one smooth motion Fu reached around and pulled her top off, exposing her upper body to the warm air of the room. Admittedly, this was not the first time Naruto had seen Fu like this, however in this setting, with them so intimately close it seemed so different. Sitting there with Fu on his lap, he couldn't help but remember, or perhaps realize truly for the first time just how beautiful the Jinchuriki was. Her caramel skin was so exotic, and that was only enhanced now she was baring her breasts, a cute, flustered blush on her cheeks as he said nothing. Slowly he pulled of his own top, just doing what felt comfortable, like Fu said. "You really are beautiful, Fu." Any response the girl might have had became an unintelligible mumble as Naruto captured her lips, rolling them around so they were now properly on the bed. As if by some long-forgotten instinct his hand came up, sliding across her supple skin until they found her chest. Hesitantly, and then more confidently as her slight, quivering moans urged him on, he began to gently play with her soft, but firm breasts. It was an unfamiliar, but not unwelcome visceral pleasure simply having that soft, yielding flesh in his hands, Fu's moans reverberating in his mouth as they continued their passionate kiss. It seemed perfect, however Naruto hadn't experienced anything that was to come that night yet. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.